You know, a lot of words originate with some Germanic tribe that gave the Romans grief at some point or another. You get the Vandals, from which we get the word vandalism, because they gave Rome a light sacking at one point. We have the Franks, from which we get the word France. The Burgundians, from which we get a reddish-purple colour. And the Goths, from whomst we get the word for sad musicians dressed in black, Victorian-era horror stories, and medieval architecture. Which is an odd mix, if you ask me. So, what is the story of the original Goths, and how did they end up being such a Roman boogeyman? Let's start at the very beginning. The Goths were a people who spoke a language which falls under the umbrella term of Germanic. We actually have a bit of the old Gothic language that survives till today, and we have a lot of names, a lot of which correspond fairly well with the Old Norse language that survives from the sagas that were written down just after the Viking Age. This, along with an account by the Gothic historian Jordanes, has led many historians to hypothesize that they originated in Scandinavia. But at some point, probably in the 1st century CE, the Gothic tribes started to migrate southwards, down along the same rivers that later Scandinavians would also explore, and they settled the area that is modern Ukraine and the north of the Black Sea. And it's here, in around the 240s, 250s CE, that the Goths explode onto the historical stage. Of course, they've been doing things for ages, but in history, nothing you do starts to really matter until you come into contact with a literate society who can write down what you've done. So, as far as we're concerned, the Goths start to exist when they come into contact with the Romans. And this first real contact with the Goths doesn't go particularly well for the empire. A Gothic king called Cniva crosses the Danube and attacks the city of Philippopolis. But luckily for the Romans, help is nearby. The capable Emperor Decius, at the head of 3 legions, attacks the Goths with the hope of driving them back across the Danube, as the Romans always do. They deal with barbarians constantly, should be a piece of cake. But it doesn't work out like that. The Romans get absolutely torn apart. The emperor is killed, as is his son, and the legions are almost completely wiped out. So from the off, the Goths have established a reputation as the tribe that introduces the Romans to new and unpleasant surprises. Like, for example, in the years following the victory, when the Goths penetrate into the inner provinces of the empire. They sack the cities of Asia Minor. They sack the Greek cities. Athens and Sparta both get a quick sacking. There's even a battle in the same spot where the 300 Spartans faced off against the Persians at Thermopylae, which is apparently just the go-to spot for Greeks to defend against outside invaders. And it actually works this time. But regardless, this signifies a little bit of a change. The frontier provinces were very used to Germanic incursions. Tribesmen would pop across the border all the time to do a quick bit of looting. The legions usually saw them off before things got too serious. But the inner provinces of the empire, provinces like Greece and Asia, they hadn't seen any kind of violence in at least 400 years. This must have been a really unpleasant shock for them. And for about the next 15 years or so, the Goths, along with various other Germanic tribes, basically have free reign over the Balkans. Occasionally the Romans will try and remind them who really has the bigger empire around here, but it's the middle of the crisis of the 3rd century. The Roman Empire is in literal pieces. The Goths can kind of do what they want. That is until the Illyrian emperors come to save the empire. In the later years of the crisis, most emperors are army officers who are raised to the position by their own troops. And despite the fact that they mostly reign for very, very short amounts of time, and a lot of them are murdered, they are mostly really quite competent. And this string of competent emperors starts with Claudius II, otherwise known as Claudius Gothicus, spoiler alert. He gathers together a large Roman army, and he faces off against the Gothic king Cniva at a place called Naissus in modern-day Serbia. And here, Claudius pulls an absolutely classic maneuver. The good old, pretend you're running away so you can draw the enemy into a trap trick. And it works. They smash the Goths, and the Romans get a fairly well-needed victory out of it. And over the next few years, the Roman Empire really bounces back and manages to keep the Goths at bay. Remember that the Goths are basically just proto-Vikings. They're pirates, man, they're raiders. They don't want to face Roman armies in pitched battles. They want to be looting, they want to be taking wealth. So now the Empire kind of has it together again a little bit. The Goths are less interested in regular raids, entirely too risky. And so, with Rome relatively strong and healthy again, the Goths and the Romans start to kind of peacefully coexist a bit. And the Goths start to separate into two very, very distinct tribes. You have the Greuthungi, who hang out to the east of the Dnieper River, and you have the Tuvingi, who hang out to the west of the Dnieper and are gently moving into the recently abandoned Roman province of Dacia. And it's during this period of peace, which lasts from around 300 to 375, that the Goths become more Roman. This is fairly standard for people living on the borders of the Roman Empire. They're trading with the Empire, they're getting all those sweet luxury goods, seeing the benefits of civilization, as it were, and adopting various aspects of it. So the Goths start to get used to these Roman trade goods, and a fair few of them even adopt the new Roman religion, Christianity. It was a slightly different brand of Christianity to the kind you might be familiar with. So typically in Christian theology, we're going to try and do this quickly because it's super complicated. You get the Trinity. So you've got the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And together they make God. But separately they are all also God, and also there's only one God, not three of them, but there's also three of them. I know, very, very simple, right? Well, in the Gothic form of Christianity, Arian Christianity, the Son is separate to and subordinate to the Father. So on like a ranking system, you've got God and Holy Spirit, I guess, and then Jesus just underneath, but then there's the rest of humanity, which Jesus is still better than because he's part God, just not fully God. Get it? It's called Arian Christianity, and that's Arian with an I, not a Y, as in it's named after the preacher Arius who came up with the theology. So it's got nothing to do with like the Aryan tribe or any of the Nazi stuff. Although it did get very popular in Germany at one point, so maybe it's got a little bit in common with the Aryan stuff. And not only were the Goths becoming more Roman, a lot of the Romans were becoming more Gothic, which is kind of unusual. I mean, the Romans did adopt things from the cultures that they conquered, but they hadn't conquered and incorporated the Goths, they just lived on the border with them. But a lot of this might have had to do with the fact that there were actually more Goths in the Empire, because so many of them were being employed in the Roman army. The constant wars of the 3rd century had really worn down the Empire, and the legions were basically in tatters towards the end of it. So a lot of the 4th century emperors found it cheaper and easier to hire Gothic mercenaries as opposed to trying to raise new legions. Goths fight both for and against Constantine during his many civil wars. And Julian's army is not only made up of many Goths, but a lot of his officers and closest advisors were themselves Gothic. On top of this, the Gothic style of dress had become fairly popular in the new Roman capital of Constantinople, much to the chagrin of conservative Romans, who were sneering at citizens of the empire who chose to adopt the dress and mannerisms of these tall northern warriors. You know, like wearing animal skins, wearing trousers, all that kind of barbarous dressing. And so everything was great and relatively peaceful until 376, when the Roman border guards along the Danube were met by the terrifying sight of tens of thousands of Goths amassed on the other bank. And this was more than a little worrying because there was only a skeleton force along the northern border of the empire at the time. Most of the army was in the east, dealing with the Sassanid Persians. Luckily, this time, the Goths weren't here to sack anything. They were actually coming as desperate refugees. They wanted to be taken into the empire and were happy to be subject to the Roman Emperor Valens. And the emperor was absolutely thrilled. His empire was suffering a very, very serious manpower shortage, so what he saw were not only thousands of refugees, but thousands of potential soldiers just ready to be sworn into the legions and sent back to the border to help guard it against less friendly barbarians. But there were an awful lot of Goths to be letting over at one time, so he let the Tuvingi cross, but he told the Greuthungi, look, just stay on that side of the Danube and we'll deal with you once we've done with, you know, your kinsmen, the Tuvingi over here. Once we got them settled, we'll sort you out. But waiting wasn't really the option that the Greuthungi wanted, because the reason they were fleeing was only just behind them. In the last few years, a group of probably Turkic nomads had appeared from Central Asia, started migrating west, and were currently tearing up what is today Ukraine and Russia. These people would become very, very important to later Roman history. They're called the Huns. The Huns had already done their fair share of damage to the Goths. They'd actually met them in battle a few years previously, and the Greuthungi had been so thoroughly beaten that their king had actually committed suicide in the aftermath of the battle. The rest of the tribe that survived had straight up upped and left from the lands they had settled, with the hope of managing to make it within the borders of the empire where they might be safe. And now they were being told, hey, you know, we know your lives are in danger, but just wait on the other side of the Danube a bit longer. The emperor hasn't found you a nice bit of land yet. Unbelievably, things weren't much better for the Tuvingi who had been allowed to cross. So the plan was they were going to try and conscript as many of the Gothic men into the Roman army as possible, and the families would be allotted bits of land for them to live off of. In the meantime, though, the Roman state would have to feed them. This wasn't much of a stretch for the Roman Empire. The grain dole had been a thing for centuries. They were very used to having to feed people en masse. It's Rome. They count everything. They make constant lists of everything. They know how to organize this kind of thing. So what got in the way was not the inability of the Romans to feed the Goths. It was the corruption of the Roman officials put in charge of doing exactly that. Most of the food allocated for the Gothic tribes was sold off before it even reached the Danube to feed them. A great deal of the starving Goths were forced to sell basically all of their possessions in order to get enough food to sustain themselves in the short term. And at this point, the Romans get really, really exploitative. They start selling dog meat to the Goths in exchange for Gothic children that they can then sell into slavery at roughly the exchange rate of 1 child per dog. The Goths start to get reasonably very, very unhappy about this, so the Romans decide they're going to march them south to somewhere where they can better police them. And this didn't work out. To start with, there were entirely too many Goths. Normally what the Roman Empire did when it admitted tribes into the empire is it disarmed them and it split them up. That way they could never be a threat. But there were so many more Goths than there were Romans that the Romans had to keep them together so that they could basically keep an eye on them all at the same time. And although they tried to disarm the Goths, they didn't get particularly far because, again, there were simply too many of them. It also didn't work because in order to supervise this great march southwards, they had to pull all of the troops from the border forts of the Danube. This meant that there was no one guarding the Grithungi, who, remember, had been left on the dangerous side of the river. And so with no one supervising, the Grithungi just thought, sod it, we might as well just cross and meet up with our kinsmen on the other side, which is precisely what they did. So the Romans naturally start to get nervous. The Goths that they were meant to be protecting now hate them, and the Goths who they had denied asylum to also hate them, but are also here now, so there's that. And then an incident happens. Whilst just outside the city of Marcianopolis in Thrace, the Goths try to go to the city market to try and buy some food, because, like I said, they are starving. However, the Romans, for some reason or another, possibly so they can continue to extort the Goths, refuse to let them go to the market. And a fight breaks out, and a couple of legions are murdered by Gothic warriors. Obviously, this doesn't look good. So the Roman commander decides to call a meeting of all the Gothic chiefs. So he calls in a guy called Fritigern, who's one of the Gothic chiefs, and then another guy who's not as important to history, so we're not going to bother with him. So the idea is this is going to be a meeting where they hash everything out, they, put aside all of the differences, they come up with some solid rules to make sure that no incident like this happens again. And of course the Goths are immensely enthusiastic about this, and it's all going to go very well, but shock, horror, they've been led into a Red Wedding-esque trap. The retainers of the Goths are all killed at dinner, and the chieftains are all captured. Now, I genuinely don't know what the Roman commander's plan was here, because it seems what he did is he captured the Gothic chiefs. He then, yelled out of the window to the Gothic tribes, hey, got your chief, and then was incredibly surprised when the Goths turn around with their very, very unconfiscated weapons and demand their chiefs back. So to give you a rundown on the luck of the Romans so far, tens of thousands of tribesmen appear on their border asking to become allies, and within months, these same tribesmen are now besieging the city of Marcianopolis. Luckily, one of the captured chiefs, Fritigern, has a plan. He says to the Roman commander, look, just unchain me, send me back to my tribe, I will show them that I'm safe and that you didn't just murder me, and then I'll convince them to stand down and we can go back to being peaceful friends. And the Romans go, yep, sounds like a great idea, out you go. So Fritigern is unchained, he's let outside, he rejoins his tribe, and he turns on the Romans as quickly as they turned on him, and he gets the two tribes together, and he says, sod it, we're marching north and we're going to start sacking things, just like in the old days. The Roman commander, very annoyed at this, decides to follow the Goths with his much smaller army. And Fritigern turns around and thinks, well, we're rebelling now, so in for penny, in for pound, annihilates the small Roman army. It must have been incredibly satisfying for the Goths to murder all of the Romans who had mistreated them so much over the last few months. And now they've got all this spectacular Roman equipment and armour, which makes them even more dangerous, and so they get to doing what they're best at. Sacking, and looting, and pinching people's goods. By 378, however, both the Eastern Emperor, Valens, and the Western Emperor, Gratian, had gotten it together and were ready to sort the Goths out. Sure, Fritigern and his tribesmen had managed to massacre the small frontier force that had been left to guard them, but now a proper Roman army was on its way. They outnumbered the Goths, they were better equipped than the Goths, they were better trained than the Goths, and they were led by 2 emperors. Well, 1 emperor, because according to Ammianus Marcellinus here, who's our main source on this little war, the Emperor Valens was incredibly self-conscious about the fact that his own subjects didn't think he was a particularly good soldier, which when you're a Roman emperor isn't a great thing to be said about you. So he really wanted to force a solution to this Gothic problem very quickly before people could say he was bailed out by his much younger nephew. When he was told that Fritigern and his Goths were camped just outside the city of Adrianople, he knew that this was his chance. And so, when day broke on the 9th of August, 378, the Emperor Valens marched upwards of 30,000 soldiers 8 miles across rough terrain in the scorching summer heat. When the Romans finally see the Goths, they find them encamped at the top of a hill, and they've put all of their wagons into a circle called a wagon lager, from which they mean to defend themselves. So despite the fact that the Goths have lit fires to get smoke in the eyes and breaths of the Romans are dehydrated, the legions are all exhausted. Despite this, they can see that they outnumber the Goths 2, maybe 3 to 1, and are immensely confident and ready for a fight. But before battle, the Emperor Valens and Fritigern have to do some negotiations. It's fairly probable that Valens still hoped he could force the Goths into a deal and try and recruit them into his own legions to fight other barbarian tribes with. And Fritigern knew that he was outnumbered, he knew he was outgunned, and to make things worse, most of his best warriors weren't there. They were out foraging and raiding, and who knows when they were going to get back. But the soldiers of the Roman left flank were a little bit too eager, and they advanced without orders, thinking they could just sweep the Goths aside. They didn't get particularly far and they were driven back, but at this point the Emperor thinks, well, die is cast, battle has begun, off we go, and the Roman army advances up to the wagon lager. And so the Romans and the Goths engage in hand-to-hand combat, and it looks like the Romans are going to win when suddenly the Pelennor Fields thing happens. You know, also the thing that happens in basically any fantasy battle ever. The cavalry rock up out of nowhere and attack the Romans from behind. All of those Gothic warriors who are away foraging for food, mostly mounted, suddenly arrive back at camp at once, and that's just it for Rome. They roll up the Roman flank. Ammianus Marcellinus says the Romans end up packed in so closely together that they can't even move to raise their swords and fight back. And about 2/3 of the army is massacred there and then. Nobody knows for sure how the Emperor Valens died because his body was never recovered. I remember reading, I can't remember the exact source, somewhere that he was struck by a stray arrow. There is a famous story that him and his guardsmen retreat to like this little farmhouse, and the Goths show up and they insist, look, come out, whoever you are. But the Roman guardsmen shoot arrows at them from the top windows of the farmhouse. So the Goths huff and they puff and they burn the fucking farmhouse down with Valens inside, and that's the end of the Emperor Valens. And that is the Battle of Adrianople, which is, for many people, the starting point when they mark the beginning of the real decline of the Roman Empire. Truthfully speaking, the Romans do recover from this. The Goths don't go on to, well, they do go on to sack Rome, but they don't go on to completely collapse the Roman Empire. But a new precedent is set. Beforehand, whenever there was a huge humiliation like this, like an emperor being killed in battle, there needed to be some kind of vengeance. The Roman army would go on the offensive, go into the homelands of these people, and start wiping things out. That doesn't happen after Adrianople. The Romans are forced to negotiate with the Goths. and not from a position of strength by any means. So in many ways, yes, one of the great factors that will lead to the end of the Roman Empire, the deals they make with barbarians where they give away vast tracts of land in exchange for peace with them or maybe getting them on side, that does kind of begin here. What it really kind of does though is mark out the Goths for a kind of historical celebrity. They hurt Rome in ways that it's not used to being hurt. They're the first ones to kill emperors in battles with foreigners. They do it twice. They're the first people to sack Rome in over 800 years. The first people to sack Rome once it gets its empire. And they're the first barbarian tribe to get a kind of federate deal where they get land in exchange for just please stop breaking our stuff. The Visigoths, the Western Goths, our good old friends, the Turingi, they end up being settled in what is today Aquitaine in the south of France, and eventually they become the Visigothic Kingdom of Spain, which will exist until the Muslim conquest in the 8th century. And the Greuthungi, the Eastern Goths, they're the ones who occupy Italy after the fall of the Western Empire, and they will do until Justinian comes and boots them out, and that's kind of the end of them. And so I guess the lesson here is, be nice to refugees, I guess, or they might end up setting up autonomous kingdoms in the south of Gaul. Something like that. Maybe it's a lesson about how Scandinavian pirates are historically always causing issues. Either way, thanks for watching.